Senator Ludlam.
Thanks, Mr Deputy President. Pursuant to Standing Order 74.5, I ask the Minister representing the Minister for Resources, Mr Frydenberg, for an explanation as to why answers have not yet been provided to questions on notice number 2642 and 2907. 2907 notice was given on the 19th of January of this year, so it's only, I acknowledge, a matter of a week or so overdue, relates to the transportation of radioactive materials through Australian ports from overseas. 2642 notice of that question was given on 24 November 2015, that is now months overdue, around shipments of radioactive waste from France that have since returned to Lucas Heights in Sydney. I'm seeking for some explanation as to why these answers to these questions are so vastly overdue.
Senator Canavan.
Yes, thank you, Mr Deputy President, and I thank the senator for the advance warning before question time of this issue. I have asked the Minister for Resources and Energy in his office to come back with some information about the delay on these questions, and I'm happy to provide that information to Senator Ludlam as soon as it is available.
Senator Ludlam.
Mr President, I'd like to briefly take note of Senator Canavan's response. I thank you for that. I understand there's also been a bit of churn in that portfolio, and maybe Mr Frydenberg is taking time to get his head across the issues. Nonetheless, these are immensely serious issues regarding the return of Australian obligated nuclear fuel or reprocessing wastes from nuclear research reactor operations here in Sydney from reprocessing plants in Europe and elsewhere. And I don't propose to detain the chamber for long, but it does go, I think, to the significance of the bigger picture of what's occurring here and the fact that Mr Shorten, the leader of the opposition apparently, rather than outright condemning and putting to rest propositions to import not just Australian obligated nuclear materials from overseas, but in fact turn outback South Australia into the world's radioactive waste dump, rather than putting Premier Weatherall in his box in the public interest and ruling out any proposition to do such a thing, he is in fact entertaining the notion. It's good that Senator Edwards is still here, because in some ways Senator Edwards has been leading the debate, and I acknowledge Senator Edwards' a long-standing interest in this issue and the fact that he is leading the debate and put quite a detailed submission to the South Australian Royal Commission led by Mr Scarce. I will make a couple of remarks on that basis before I close this afternoon. The fact is Australia has been, for decades, has been unable to figure out how to handle the relatively small, by international standards, inventory of radioactive waste from research reactor operations at Lucas Heights. I'm not attempting to minimise the sheer volume or activity of the waste that's being generated in Australia, but compared to that is produced by commercial nuclear reactor operations in countries around the world that did go down the nuclear power path, Australia has a relatively small inventory of waste from the 10 and then 20 megawatt research reactors that have operated in Sydney. And yet look at the multi-decade rolling debacle of attempting to site this radioactive waste at some remote location in Australia, and compare that, the consistency, the remarkable consistency of the Australian experience of the experience of trying to find somewhere to dump radioactive waste in jurisdictions overseas. What is consistent between the Australian experience and, just to pick one example, the experience in the United States? It is that it is remote Aboriginal communities that have been asked to bear the brunt of the world's and the nation's most dangerous categories of waste. And you have to wonder why it is. I asked ANSTO a couple of years ago, and their answers were surprisingly consistent with those contained in a promotional video by Pangaea Corporation that attempted to, well, they didn't attempt to provoke, they absolutely did provoke debate in 1999 about importing of radioactive spent fuel from overseas for dumping in Australia. And in fact, Mr Scarce's Royal Commission uses very similar language as well. Why is it that the nuclear industry here and globally looks for high isolation sites, stable geology, low groundwater or very deep groundwater with low movements, low seismic activity, a long way from agricultural areas, a long way from mineral resources, and most importantly, a long way from population centres. Why is it that they seek such sites and then shortlist places like southwest South Africa or Mongolia or inland South Australia for that matter? Why is it that the nuclear industry looks for these remote, high isolation sites? The scarce Royal Commission gives it away, in one sense. They propose each facility, hypothetical facilities in this case, they say in these facilities the risk of the radionuclides migrating into the environment is managed by the geology in which the facility is situated as well as its engineered barriers. And a little bit later, and I'm reading from the executive summary here, each facility is sited in geological conditions that naturally limit the potential pathways for migration. What is that code for, colleagues? It is that the engineered containment will fail. And when the engineered containment fails and the facility begins to leak, they want to be as far from it as possible. They want that stable geology so that when their radioactive waste dump leaks, it's a long way from them. And that was in the Pangaea video, and I thought that was a remarkable moment of honesty. I had a similar moment of honesty at a Senate committee hearing from ANSTO a couple of years ago. Here it is again in the Royal Commission's findings. Geological containment. When our waste dump leaks, we want it to be out there in the middle of nowhere. Now, as those proponents from the Howard government and then Minister Martin Ferguson, more recently Mr Ian MacDonald, discovered when they prosecuted their case, McFarlane discovered, going back to Senator Minchin, but particularly from the Muckaty experience, was when you try and dump this material in the middle of nowhere, you find people speaking up for that country. You find people who have occupied that country for tens of thousands of years who put very strongly that they are not in the middle of nowhere. That, in fact, the idea that if it is so dangerous that it needs to be moved as far from human habitation as possible, then dumping it on an Aboriginal outstation or a cattle station in the Barkly region is in fact totally inappropriate. And no wonder the people at the 6 sites around the country that now responsibility for this issue having passed to Minister Frydenberg are discovering people do not want this stuff, and it's very easy to understand why not. If it is so urgent to move this stuff from Lucas Heights because it's unsafe, how can you then make the case to the local people who you're asking to host this material that it is suddenly safe? And Senator Edwards, who has, I think, upped the ante on the debate somewhat by proposing and going even further than Mr Scarce has done in his South Australian Royal Commission, which, by the way, effectively pronounced the uranium industry moribund correctly, pronounced the global nuclear power industry moribund correctly, acknowledged that there was simply no possibility of a commercial nuclear power industry getting on its feet anytime soon in Australia correctly, that the reprocessing market is overdone, that there is no market for fuel enrichment in this country, nevertheless left the door open for the import of spent fuel. Is there a market for spent fuel that would allow you to adequately figure out what kind of price we could get for importing this poisonous material from jurisdictions overseas? No, there is not. So in the absence of a market, in the absence of any kind of international experience around price, they just made up some numbers. They made numbers up. They have no idea what kind of revenues you could get from hosting international nuclear waste. They end up with $500 billion. How on earth do you arrive at a figure like $500 billion in various other countries, putting this stuff on ships, and it's somehow magically arriving in outback South Australia? How do you get at a number like that? And the way that they did it was by saying you get $5 billion in annual revenues every year for the first 30 years, just made up numbers. They just made that figure up by inventing a per tonne figure and then rounding up, with 390,000 tonnes of spent fuel around the world, that you end up with about, I think it was around 60-odd thousand tonnes of the material landing in outback South Australia, and then you put the profit in a sovereign wealth fund. And over 120 years or so, you end up with this imaginary $500 billion figure. And that's how Senator Edwards, who's then leveraged these ideas and gone even further and said, what if we took 4,000 tonnes of that material and fed it into imaginary PRISM reactors that don't exist? and won't exist until at the earliest 2040. If Senator Edwards wants to enlighten us either now or at another time on what he proposed to happen to the other 56,000 tonnes, no idea. Apparently it is just left in some kind of outdoor car park in remote South Australia sitting on the surface. The costs of a secure, dedicated port, not included. The costs of a dedicated rail corridor to inland South Australia, not included. The costs to the radical increases in security that you would need to safeguard this material from mishandling or misadventure, not included. The cost of safeguarding it for 300,000 years, not included. The cost of dropping it a mile below the desert in South Australia in 100 years' time, not included. How on earth has the debate come to this, where the best the major parties appear to be able to offer up for the people of South Australia as the economy slowly caves in is hosting the world's radiotoxic waste? How on earth has it come to this? This parliament and the South Australian Parliament should have ruled this out. Mr Scarce has done us something of a favour. I must admit I was a sceptic. I didn't think it was the right vehicle using a Royal Commission for something like this to do some taxpayer-funded industry research, but nonetheless they've come back and said the industry is stuffed, it's barely viable, but why don't we, on the basis of completely imaginary fabricated economics, take the world's most lethal garbage and stick it in a parking lot out the back of South Australia? Instead of repudiating that proposal, Mr Shorten is entertaining it, Mr Weatherill is entertaining it, Mr Turnbull is entertaining it. This debate should have been closed at the point at which the industry admitted that the reason it wants remote sites is because their engineered containment barriers will leak. Surely we can do better than that for the people of South Australia. I look forward to getting some answers from the Minister on the questions that I've raised.